Buon pomeriggio.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here, so many of you. It is a great honor for me to introduce Professor Tore Ellingsen, Professor of Economics at the School of Economics of Stockholm. I believe that you already learned some details. Ellingsen got his degree in economics in Norway, then he studied in Stockholm. He was granted the PhD at the London School of Economics, and as for 1996, he has a chair of economics in Stockholm. He carried out research as an industrial economist, or perhaps he should be termed as a scholar of industrial organization. And he indeed focused on game theory. Professor Tore Ellingsen may indeed be considered as a scholar of game theory. The reason why he's here with us today is that he's one of the most original player in the field of behavioral economics and experimental economics, or experimental game theory. Most specifically, and this is a very important field, he concentrated on a branch that tries better to understand the motivations as they are studied by economists. That is, how to add to the economic reasoning the whole of potential economic motivations and social motivation as well, and sentiments, feelings, moral feelings characterizing moral action. Now, to introduce Professor Ellingsen, and only very briefly because I won't take any more time, so just to say a couple of words, I wish to say that we should make reference to one of the founding father of economics, i.e. Adam Smith, who wants to add gayness to the sad science. Know that usually the concept of economic efficiency is explained based on the coordination virtues of the market through an invisible hand. And over and above that, Adam Smith is the author of the theory of moral feelings, presenting many moral feelings that may motivate human action. Adam Smith is the philosopher of moral feelings and the philosopher of the visible hand. Among the most important moral feelings, he refers to sympathy and the fellow feelings, that is this expression of sympathy towards those that have industrial relations with us. He is mastered as a philosopher. That was quoted also in the slides by Professor Tore Ellingsen, and I was very pleased of seeing that, because I myself, before becoming an economist, was, and perhaps still am, a philosopher myself. So to learn that colleagues that are fully fledged economists and that draw so importantly to these major thinkers cannot but be a very nice discovery for myself. So the master of Adam Smith, as you say, that is David Hume, that Adam Smith considered as an important thinker, stressed the importance of the presence and simultaneously of selfishness, while at the same time the development of attachment feelings and social feelings alike, that develop when social rules obtain. So there is the feeling basically is guided by the desire to conform with the others. Economists have neglected this aspect for too long, and these are the philosophers that actually triggered the study of economics. They focused more on the wealth of nation rather than on the moral feelings as the two aspects of Adam Smith. Now, going back to the 70s and 80s, top economists trying to capture these further elements, these reasons for action, including them in their models. And that has been done from a standardizing point of view. We can, for example, refer to Sanyo, Amartya Sen, or Kenaro. And this established some kind of, or this science established a relationship with philosophy. But when such models had to be implemented with the idea of social well-being, there was always the problem that the description of the economic behavior was that of the rational, selfish man. So the noblest aspiration had to come to terms with the impossibility to do very noble things if the economic action had to only to be guided by the selfish and rational attitudes. So you had to be compatible with that type of incentives that would do away with many other options. Now, over time, and Professor Tore Ellingsen is indeed one of the key player in this development, we try to describe economic actions with a wealthier range of feelings. Indeed, there are other motivations, not just the selfish motivation. As a matter of fact, the concept of social preference was introduced as that of mutuality. And this was done modeling the economic behavior with economic models and with an important development of experiments. And Professor Tore Ellingsen, he is certainly very competent. He's a fully fledged scholar on both these fields. He is indeed a microeconomist, an experimentalist, a theoretician of game theory, and he's certainly one of the most representative player in this branch of study. And amongst the experimentalists, I believe that he's one of the most important because he drafted theories and then he controls his theories as well as other assumptions. So he's not just collecting data with his experiments, but somehow he may confirm innovative assumptions. Then I'm going to give him the floor straight away, but there's just one thing that I'd like to add, and that is that there are examples of his very recent experimental studies that are most important are the ones aimed at proving whether there is or there is not a propensity to lie or a propensity to lie or an aversion to lying in the economic behaviors. And he says that despite what economists say, and that is that we are all opportunistic, as a matter of fact, indeed, there is an aversion to lies rather than propensity to lie. This is not total, the aversion is not total, but it grows by the size of the lie that you have to tell, and it grows also with the intensity of the promise you enter. So if we make very strong and heavy promises, we tend to lie. Well, if this study had been carried out with Italian politicians rather than with Swedish students, probably the result would have been different. But anyway, it is always interesting, obviously, to see the result that was obtained with these experimental studies. And it is very interesting that there is comparison between the generalized mainstream ideas on economic attitudes as contraposed to the Kantian ideal whereby a lie is always a failure. And there is another important study on guilt aversion, something that we would experiment when others have a great expectation on our behavior. So this guilt basically is the result that we obtain when we believe that other people expect something from our behavior. And again, going against previous conventional assumption, Professor Tore Ellingsen has proved that guilt aversion is not that strong if it is just based on the fact that we believe that other people may expect that we do something. So there should be additional motivation explaining what happened that is not 100% selfish. What is most interesting, and I believe that he will dwell on that, and he's going to be very interesting to discuss on that. What is very interesting is the contribution to modifying our idea of incentives. There's a hot debate on how to incentivize workers, managers, And economists always believed that material incentives were most important, despite the fact that psychologists have always maintained, especially in recent times, that the opposite was true. This led to important mistakes being made in economic discipline. For example, many hopes were pinned on incentives given to the managers that obviously brought very negative results. And Professor Tore Ellingsen has a very nice explanation to that, in that we attach importance to the esteem, and we're very proud of being estimated and praised by people that we praise and holding great esteem. And these are either philosophical or psychological concepts. And these things have been added in microeconomic models that are very sophisticated, where we have the and then we have a theory explaining many evidences. So if an employer checks on his workers too strictly, obliging them, forcing them rather than trusting them, he basically will obtain less of a cooperative attitude on their side. So basically there's a there's a mechanism, there's a negative mechanism that can be triggered by this kind of lack of trust. So you see that Professor Tore Ellingsen is a very creative writer, contradicting many of the things that we would usually expect from economists, so from mainstream theory. So I believe that he can certainly pave the way to new and innovative approaches in economics. Having said this much, and I think that I've been taking up even too much of your time, with the great honor and the great pleasure of giving him, I have the great honor and great pleasure of giving him the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those kind words, and thank you so much to the organizer for setting up this wonderful event that I think must be unparalleled in the world. In the spring of 2001, I went to New York on a holiday. Busy with work and family, and I was never much of a traveler, I hadn't been to New York for a decade. Exiting the taxi from the airport, it suddenly struck me that I didn't have a clue about the tipping convention on Manhattan. Here is my dilemma. On the one hand, the taxi driver had behaved impeccably. That is, he appeared to have taken the shortest route, and he was friendly enough. On the other hand, the dollar was very expensive at the time. So, could I please have the picture back up? And I was paying with my own money, and the bill was quite hefty. Maybe some loose connection. Therefore, my desire was to pay the conventional tip, but no more than that. In the end, I decided to ask the driver about the standard rate of tipping on Manhattan. Looking very uncomfortable, the driver insisted that the tip was entirely up to the customer, and that he could not help me in making a decision. Thanks. So 5 minutes later, having retrieved the guidebook from my suitcase, I laid back on the hotel bed, wishing that I'd paid more. Can you imagine what it felt like? I'm convinced that many of you instinctively understand both my desire to act appropriately, as well as my feelings upon failing to do so. Surely it would be impossible to maintain a tipping rate of close to 20%, as in New York, were it not for the fact that many people desire to follow social norms and feel bad when they do not. But here's a remarkable fact. For more than a century, these desires and feelings, which most of you, I think, can identify with, have had essentially no place in economic theory. No matter how you twist and turn the standard textbook model of economic behavior, it offers no compelling reason for why a lonely visitor to New York pays tips for good service or feels bad about having under-tipped a driver who didn't even want to disclose the conventional tipping rate. What is worse, the textbook doesn't even say much about the role of social norms in supporting honesty, civic virtues, or good workplace behavior either. Behavioral economics is the name for research that attempts to base economic theory on better psychological foundations. The purpose of this talk is to offer a behavioral economist's personal view on human motivation in general and norm obedience in particular. And be warned, when a scientist says personal view, it means that the perspective will be utterly egocentric, with a shameless focus on own research, and this talk is no exception. Now, consider the following question. To what extent is it wise, when designing the institutions of a society or the internal governance structure of a business firm, to assume the worst about the rulers, the citizens, or the workers? Now, worst-case thinking has a long and distinguished pedigree. For example, David Hume, in 1742, insisted that a political system ought to assume that rulers are knaves, not angels. In modern times, Oliver Williamson's theory of the firm assumes that people are opportunistic with guile, lying and cheating if it serves their interest. If we take such reasoning to the extreme, as is many economists' natural inclination, what does it imply for the organization of society? Well, frankly, the simplest economic model, formulated by the famous Chicago economist Gary Becker, suggests death penalty for the slightest misdemeanor, supposing that the evidence is convincing enough. What a vast discrepancy there is between this view and popular management strategies such as trusting, respecting, and empowering the workforce. I hope to convince you that there is a connection between the small issue of tipping and the large issue of constructing appropriate incentives for people to obey laws and to do a good job, and that this connection has to do with individuals' desire to comply with social norms. However, in order to prove my point, I need to provide you with a little background. Now, of course, economists never actually denied that social norms are important. What happened was that norms somehow dropped below their radar screens. Now, this is no place for a detailed recapitulation of the history of economic thought about social norms, but some background will be useful. Unlike physics, where the state of knowledge appears to move uniformly forward, at least as seen from my frame of reference, the social sciences have occasional lapses where time moves backwards. That is, the wisdom of our Newtons is only partially integrated in the work of our Einsteins. The upside of this phenomenon is that reading 18th century social science classics is a more exciting experience than reading the natural science classics of the same period. My exposé will start already in 1651 with Thomas Hobbes's famous book, Leviathan. My favorite quote about human motivation in Hobbes runs as follows: "Desire of praise disposes to laudable action, such as pleases those whose judgment they value." In other words, Hobbes thought that people are motivated not only by material self-interest, but also by social esteem, especially the favorable opinion of respectable others. Well, Hobbes notwithstanding, economic theory really starts about a century later with David Hume's book from 1739, A Treatise of Human Nature. As the book's title indicates, Hume was convinced, here's David Hume, Hume was convinced that society is best understood when viewed through the lens of human psychology. One of my favorite David Hume quotes runs as follows: "Though fame in general be agreeable, yet we receive a much greater satisfaction from the approbation of those whom we ourselves esteem and approve of, than those whom we hate and despise." I anticipate that you may have two reactions to this quote. The first is déjà vu. This is just a restatement of Hobbes's notion of desire for praise. The second reaction you may have is confusion. Is this the same David Hume, you may wonder, who in 1742, or in this talk just a couple of minutes ago, advocated the view that all rulers are knaves? Yes, it is indeed the same David Hume. And there is no contradiction. Hume argued that all rulers tend to be knaves, not that all humans tend to be knaves. The difference, according to Hume, is that honor or prestige, which keeps humans in check when acting on their own accord, is insufficient for checking the behavior of rulers as a collective. Hume saw the need for worst-case thinking in laying down the rules to govern the rulers, but did not see a need for worst-case thinking when designing institutions for ordinary people. Adam Smith was a student of David Hume's and shared most of his views regarding human nature, including the notion that people adhere to social norms for prestige or honor reasons. My favorite Adam Smith quote runs as follows: "Nature, when she formed man for society, endowed him with an original desire to please and an original aversion to offend his brethren. She taught him to feel pleasure in their favorable and pain in their unfavorable regard. She rendered their approbation most flattering and most agreeable to him for its own sake, and their disapprobation most mortifying and most offensive." Now, it's a striking fact that Adam Smith's first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments from 1759, is also his last book, because despite the fact that better-known Wealth of Nations was published in 1776, it was Moral Sentiments that Smith persisted in revising repeatedly for 30 years until the 6th edition appeared in 1790, the year of Smith's death. In fact, these two works are closely interwoven. The liberal and fair society that Smith envisaged in Wealth of Nations would, according to Smith, have to rest on the pillars of social norms he had already described in Moral Sentiments. The big paradox of modern economics is that it came to study the upper levels of Smith's theoretical construction long before paying attention to the foundations on which it had been erected. Our textbook models of competitive markets are only valid if there are basic legal institutions that protect property rights and facilitate exchange. And in order to be effective, these legal institutions in turn must be solidly grounded on widely accepted social norms. Now, when economists from about 1870 onwards paid increasing attention to markets in general and to price formation in particular, the students of social norms at universities gradually left economics, and the subject was taken over by other disciplines, not least by the emerging field of sociology that was constructed partly by frustrated economists who tired of the increasingly abstract and formal study of price formation. However, with the advent of game theory, and especially after John Nash's dissertation from 1950, the formalizers themselves had acquired a new, beautiful tool with which to re-engage in the study of social norms. The literature on repeated games, largely initiated by an article by Robert Aumann in 1959, proved to be a source of deep insight concerning the enormous potential for cooperation that exists even among people with strongly diverging interests. The general insight from the theory of repeated games among patient players is that these games tend to have a huge number of equilibria, and that it's usually possible to encourage players to cooperate rather than to defect through credible threats of moving to an equilibrium that is less desirable for the defector. Unfortunately, however, there are two problems with this approach. First, if there are many, many equilibria, the theory loses predictive power. A theory that can account for everything is not refutable, and therefore explains nothing. The second problem, and that's the problem which concerns me here, is that the theory of repeated games does not seem to offer an explanation for my behavior in New York in the spring of 2001. The whole point of my tipping example is precisely that I would not meet the taxi driver ever again. Neither were there any other people present who might punish me for under-tipping. Of course, the driver could have enlisted the help of the police if I had been refusing to pay the amount on the meter. But no policeman would enforce the tipping norm. As the driver had said himself, tipping is entirely up to you. A good theory of tipping behavior must explain why, when we visit New York and other places with strong tipping norms, we voluntarily pay good money to perfect strangers, despite the fact that these strangers seem to be much better off than many others who sit and beg on the streets of the very same cities. Preferably, the theory should also have something to say about my feelings as I lied there on my bed in the Manhattan hotel room, reading the guidebook's information about appropriate rates of tipping. Behavioral economics is now a well-established subfield of economic science. One day, the term behavioral might even come to be seen as superfluous. Good economics will then simply apply the behavioral assumptions appropriate for the case at hand. Given the recent upswing in behavioral economics, it's easy to forget just how immensely unpopular it has been. For a long time, many mainstream economists insisted on always assuming that people are selfish materialists. I vividly remember how a famous game theorist dismissed the question of tipping at restaurants. Oh, he said, tipping is small change. The implication, the theory only needs to be roughly right. Let's ignore the minor shortcomings. Like so many social scientists, he forgot that minor discrepancies between theory and evidence form the very basis of scientific discovery. If physicists had ignored minor discrepancies, we would presumably still believe that the Earth is the center of the universe. In an important contribution to behavioral economics, Gary Becker argued that people are altruistic or kind. They care about others. Now, I think that kindness colors my concern for my children, and occasionally my kindness might even suffice to help a stranger in desperate need, but it will have to be really desperate. But is kindness the reason why we cooperate with strangers? Can it explain tipping? I do not think so. And again, I would like to bring back Adam Smith as my expert witness. Okay, here he comes. Every man is much more deeply interested in whatever immediately concerns himself than in what concerns any other man. And to hear, perhaps, of the death of another person with whom we have no particular connection will give us less concern, will spoil our stomach or break our rest, much less than a very insignificant disaster which has befallen ourselves. Now, let's at least agree that we don't tip out of kindness. So why do we do it? After hours of introspection, I think I know why I tip. Let's see if you can guess it. So what exactly do you think that I felt there on the bed, having shortchanged the New York taxi driver? Did I think, and here's one alternative, oh, how embarrassing, now he'll believe that I'm a stupid, greedy bastard? Or did I think, poor driver, how disappointed he must have been? Okay, so how many believes in embarrassing? Let me show hands. And how many will believe, oh, poor driver, how disappointed may he have been? Okay, so the majority got it right. I was embarrassed. But there are two reasons why I asked you this question. The first is that much social science research is greeted with a yawn. People say, I knew that already. And to some extent you knew that already because you got some help from the introductory remarks. Psychologists have come up with a good name for this phenomenon, namely hindsight bias. But I guess you knew that already. Now, the other reason why I ask for your guess is that both the hypotheses have their proponents in the literature. The first hypothesis, the one focusing on my embarrassment, is called the shame hypothesis. The second hypothesis, the one focusing on the driver's disappointment, is called the guilt hypothesis. Okay, so I've told you that in my case, I was feeling shame. Indeed, it's the fear of shame, I think, that propels me in this very moment too. If you were to leave and dislike my talk, I'd be feeling shameful because you were thinking badly about me, rather than guilty about wasting your time. As guilt is nobler than shame, it hurts me to say it, but apparently I feel strongly enough, I'm strongly enough attached to the norm of honesty not to lie to you. In order to say a little bit more about the prevalence of guilt and shame, let me tell you about some experiments that I've been involved in. A particularly simple experiment is the so-called dictator game. In this experiment, two persons participate. In the standard design, the two persons sit in different rooms and typically are unaware of each other's identities. If the experimenter knows their identities, we have a so-called single blind design. If even the experimenter can't find out who did what, we have a double blind design. One of the persons, called the dictator or the divider, is given a sum of money by the experimenter. For concreteness, let us say that the sum is 10 euro. The other person gets nothing from the experimenter. The only task in the experiment is for the person with the money to decide how much to give to the other person. A typical pattern of behavior in dictator game experiments is that a large fraction of dividers keep everything. The second largest fraction gives exactly 1/2, in this case 5 euro, whereas most of the remaining subjects give either 2 or 3 euros. In order to find out why people give, experimenters, including myself and my colleagues, have varied different features of this very simple dictator game design. And let me just briefly tell you about some of the results that we find when we vary the design. The first result is that dividers give more money the more they know about the recipient. In the extreme case, the recipient is a close friend and gets a lot of money, typically half. However, even when the recipient is randomly chosen from a huge telephone book, there is actually considerable giving, but much less. Now, maybe this variation says something about how kindness varies with closeness, but hold off your judgment until you've heard about the other regularities. The second regularity is that dividers give more the less anonymous they are. So the anonymity can range from complete anonymity, where even the experimenter has no chance of finding out who gave what amount, to complete publicity, where even the recipient gets to know who the dictator was. The third regularity is that dividers give more if the recipient has an opportunity to send a message before the dictator chooses. And these messages typically take the form of a request or a moral argument. Fourth regularity, dividers give more if the recipient will have an opportunity to send a message after learning the divider's choice. These messages often take the form of praise, especially in the case of an even split, or disapproval, especially in the case of no sharing at all. So here, by the way, is direct evidence on the role of praise that Hobbes wrote about more than 350 years ago. In a single blind setting, the dividers give about 40% more when they anticipate written verbal feedback than they give when no feedback will be forthcoming. Now, in order to probe more directly the roles of guilt and shame, my co-authors and I, we have conducted the following experiment. First, we tell a group of dividers that they are in a dictator experiment, and then we let them make their divisions. Then we inform the dividers that, well, actually, they have an exit option. Instead of going through with the division, they can choose to stop the experiment without the recipient even learning that there would have been one. We then ask the recipients how much money they would need to have in order to prefer this exit option, and we ask it in such a way as to guarantee honest answers. So unless you're very interested in the procedures, I'll save you the details of the specific truth elicitation mechanism that we use. And I should also say that this is follow-up work that we've done after an original article by Jason Dana and his co-authors. Now, if people give for altruistic reasons, dividers should never exit for less than 10 euro. Why is that? Well, they had the opportunity to keep the 10 euro at the outset. If a divider preferred to give some money to the recipient, it means that the divider preferred that allocation to just having 10 euro for herself. Therefore, she would need to get more than 10 euro in order to exit. Right? So let me show you a graph. In this experiment, so each divider had 100 Swedish kroner. On the horizontal axis, here, on the horizontal axis, I depict how much the dividers choose to give to the recipient. Okay, so here are their donations. They vary from 0, you see, up to 100. You can't go beyond 100 because that's the amount they had. On the vertical axis, I depict how much dividers required in order to exiting instead of going through with their original decision. So these are the exit reservation prices. The size of the bubbles in the graph indicates the fraction of dividers making each pair of decisions. As you can see, the largest bubble is here at 100. So what does that mean? These are the dividers who did not give anything and who wanted at least 100 in order to exit. In other words, the largest fraction of behaviors corresponds exactly with the economics textbook model. However, the largest fraction is still a small minority of the dividers. In fact, a majority of the dividers gave something and should, according to the theories we've been talking about, require more than 100 in order to exit. Do they? Not at all. In fact, the second most common behavior is here to divide equally, to give 50, and then require only 50 in order to exit. So these subjects, just like actually 64% of all the dividers in this figure, they violate any kind of reasonable preference order that is based on the outcome exclusively. Indeed, it seems that the reason these people give in the first place is based on what the recipient believes or will believe about them. And upon learning that the recipient doesn't need to know, the subjects then behave completely selfishly. I've already told you that I personally believe more strongly in shame than in guilt. So shame would be my guess concerning the explanation of our data. Dividers give in order for recipients not to think badly of their actions, rather than in order for recipients not to be unhappy. But my argument would obviously be more convincing if I could show you an experiment which would dismiss the guilt hypothesis directly. Therefore, we conducted yet another dictator game experiment. This time, we asked recipients to guess the average amount that dividers would give. Without telling the recipients, each recipient's guess was then communicated to the corresponding divider. If the divider would be averse to feeling guilty, higher guesses now ought to be associated with higher donations. Okay? And here is a figure of our data. On the horizontal axis are the guesses. Okay, here are what dividers guessed that the average would be. So here you see one. This I should say. These are the recipients' guesses, and I think so. This was a 120 kroner experiment. That must be why there is a 120 here. Okay, so these are the recipients' guesses about how much they would be receiving on average. So these numbers are extremely optimistic here, and here are some very pessimistic numbers down there. People who think that nobody is going to give anything at all in this experiment. But most people are in between. As you can see, there is simply no correlation at all between these two magnitudes. So, my interpretation is, guilt is not showing up at all here. If it had been guilt aversion that was driving donations, you were afraid of disappointing people, well, then you should be systematically giving more, the more people were guessing that they would receive. Now, anthropologists are not surprised by our findings. Feelings of guilt turn out to be quite unusual in human cultures, and traces are found almost exclusively in modern individualistic communities. Shame, on the other hand, is a human universal. It's found in virtually all known cultures. The evolutionary anthropologist Daniel Fessler has launched the hypothesis that shame is a basic feeling that has evolved from rank-related emotions when our ancestors, human and pre-human, lived in small hierarchical groups. Already Charles Darwin, in his books Descent of Man from 1871 and The Expressions of the Emotion in Man and Animals from 1872, suggested that our feelings have deep evolutionary roots. Let me quote from Descent of Man. At how early a period the progenitors of man, in the course of their development, became capable of feeling and being impelled by the praise or blame of their fellow creatures, we cannot, of course, say. But it appears that even dogs appreciate encouragement, praise, and blame. The following is an immediate consequence of Darwin's view. Our social emotions may be every bit as poorly adapted to our current environment as our desires for fat and sugar. However, it's also possible that the lack of adaptation, as seen from the point of view of the individual, or more precisely the individual's genes, could entail fortuitous effects at the group level. That is to say, feelings of pride and shame may no longer serve an adaptive function for us, but these feelings could for a long time help to sustain cooperation at levels that may be unsustainable in the ultra-long run. Note that this argument suggests a way in which repeated games reasoning is relevant, actually, for my tipping experience after all. The repeated game strategies that were selected for in the ancestral environment may have been encoded in our instincts so as to make us do the right thing automatically. These instincts and their associated feelings now come to apply even when the situation is no longer always one of repeated interaction between individuals in tightly knit groups. Support for this view comes from experiments in which behavior is manipulated through more or less subliminal cues. For example, other things equal, the presence of an image of eyes on the computer screen or a robot in the room where dividers make their decisions, such images or such presences will increase donations in dictator games. Likewise, displays of behavior that signal gender-typical desirable traits can be primed by first getting the subject into a romantic mode. Romantically primed females signal care, romantically primed males signal resourcefulness. Now then, with these insights about human nature in hand, let's return to our original question. How should we design institutions? Should we be taking the worst case route? Or are there dangers of doing so? Within the so-called human relations school of industrial sociology, the view is that the worst case route is dangerous. Employers who behave as if their employees are lazy thieves may encourage the very lazy and opportunistic behavior that they fear. The pessimistic prophecy becomes self-fulfilling. Richard Titmuss, famous sociologist, suggested that blood donation in America went down as payment for blood was introduced because people didn't want to sell their blood for money. Now you wonder, can this be true? Can it really be counterproductive to control, penalize, or reward people? In a recent field experiment, my colleagues Carl Mellström and Magnus Johannesson demonstrated that Titmuss is right, at least when it comes to young Swedish women. The women who were offered monetary compensation were less willing to become blood donors than women who were offered no such payment. Similar negative effects of incentives have been established in several laboratory experiments where one subject is acting in the role of an employer who can decide whether or not to use control or punishment threats to induce compliance from a subject playing the role of the agent. That is, the employer chooses between trusting and not trusting the agent. In these experiments too, there are clear negative effects of the material incentives. Agents often cooperate more when trusted than when controlled. Of course, there could be several reasons for why worst-case thinking is sometimes self-fulfilling. Maybe just leading people to enter a selfish decision frame encourages selfishness. Or is it actually that payment for good deeds dilutes the social esteem that could be had because the audience cannot decide whether the behavior is idealistic or not? Recent experiments, both in the laboratory and in the field, support the latter hypothesis. When people give to charity or donate blood without being watched, material incentives serve to increase charitable behavior. But when they are watched, material incentives matter for people. they can be detrimental. My own favorite hypothesis is that an employer who himself displays selfishness is in no position to encourage unselfishness among employees. An unselfish employee doesn't care about impressing such an employer with self-sacrifice. Recall what David Hume said. We receive a much greater satisfaction from the approbation of those whom we ourselves esteem and approve of than those whom we hate and despise. Idealistic workers seeking the recognition of other idealists will work harder for a boss who has proved his own idealism than for a boss who does not even believe that idealists exist, and who therefore institutes surveillance and incentive systems to handle the worst case scenario, that workers are crooks. Now, perhaps that is why I felt extra terrible that day in New York. The taxi driver refusing to offer information about the tipping convention came across to me as a hard-working, fair-minded person whose opinion of me thus mattered all the more. Be that as it may, let us all rejoice in the fact that social science is connecting again with its roots, in particular that economics is coming back to the realm where other social sciences have been a long time, taking seriously David Hume's proposition that society is best understood in light of human psychology. And you don't need to take my word for it, or even the word of all these old, some of them dead male economists that I've shown you. Take the word of one of the leading political scientists of today, reflecting on what she has learned from studying the governance of common pool resources, many hundred fisheries, forestries, irrigation systems, and grasslands all around the world. She says, setting payoff structures for rational egoists may have been misdirected and perhaps even crowded out the formation of social norms. So, what do you think? Thank you very much.
Grazie molte per questa presentazione che credo abbia centrato perfettamente le...
Very much for your presentation, which has certainly fulfilled all my expectations. I believe we got a couple of minutes for a Q&A session. Are there any questions from the floor? Please, only short questions or short remarks. You're all kindly invited to participate. I believe that there are some microphones around. And I believe we can accept 3 questions, and then we will give the floor to our speaker to reply to your questions. And then if we have time, we will proceed with another triad of questions. So, who's going to break the ice?
Laggiù. Could I collect 3 questions so it's simple to... Laggiù c'era una persona che voleva parlare? Allora, laggiù. Il primo era quello là nell'angolo. Vabbè, niente.
Pronto? Hello. Buongiorno.
Good afternoon. I have a very simple question. You have carried out experiments, and as the chairman said initially, Professor Sacconi, this has been done in your country where there is a certain social and cultural context. Couldn't the place context, the location context where the experiment is carried out, influence the experiment itself? That is there the possibility that cultures evolve in a different way in relation to this issue. What I mean to say is the very same experiment in the 60s in Italy versus in the 90s in China may give totally different results. So this is my question. Thank you. I believe there is another request for question at the back there.
Yes, today economists have found that in many poor developed countries, developing countries, corruption is a major reason why they have not developed. And if you look at the United States today and the current crisis, I believe corruption in the government also plays a major role in why this financial crisis is occurring. And I'd be curious that, when you look at a country like Argentina, it's not the case that the people don't know that their leaders are corrupt. They absolutely are certain that their leaders are corrupt. But the people themselves also steal a little bit each day from each other. And I was wondering from your research, this sounds to me like a country that has reached one of these lower levels of equilibrium in which they're not maximizing their own welfares by cooperating. I was wondering if you had any suggestions that might change their norms of behavior.
No, volevo chiederle,
Well, I liked it when you quoted Darwin. In his work on human behavior, Darwin used to stress that drawing conclusions on the way how human beings can behave based on his evolutionary history might be a risky business, since man evolution has led to such a high level of complexity of structures, also including man's psychology, so that things that may be of a certain origin can then lead to totally different behaviors when the context has changed. So you can't infer what a person thinks just starting from the idea that his or her brain structure developed millions of years ago or thousands of years ago. So maybe this has also been the mistake of evolutionary psychology. Could this new research program of behavioral economics also be liable to this bias? If everything is boiled down to controlled experiments that probably have a circumscribed, a limited validity, couldn't this be a contribution to the mistake of old or traditional economics of reaching general conclusions, forgetting about anthropological, sociological, and cultural research, which maybe, without complicated experiments, without evolutionary explanations, have already come to these conclusions and have better appreciated how complex human behavior is?
Ora ci sono alcune risposte, poi vedi se c'è tempo.
Let's proceed with the answers, and if there's time, we will move to other questions.
And I've had only little time to think about them, so my answers won't be as perfect as I would wish them to be. So let's start with the question of the cultural context of experiments and the conclusions that you can draw from them. Yes, indeed, this is something that we do know, having conducted the same set of experiments all over the world. This is true in particular for the so-called ultimatum game, but also to some extent the dictator game has been conducted in very many different cultures. And we know that people's behavior differ very wildly. There is a very nice book summarizing this evidence. The book is called Foundations of Human Sociality. If I learn something from that book is that there seems to be a universal tendency to try to follow norms, and people bring their norms into the lab with them. So they try to understand the lab experiment in terms of, they ask themselves, what should a person like me do in a situation like this? And they try to interpret the experimental situation through some analogy with a situation in the society where they live. So this cultural relativity, it seems to me, is a very encouraging thing. It offers hope because it really means that human behavior can be changed through cultural change. We don't need to change, the basic human psychology, which maybe we're all really the same, right? When someone is adopted from Africa to Sweden, they quickly adopt the Swedish way of being. So I think that the very fact that these experiments play out differently in different cultures, is what gives us hope that the cultural channel is indeed a viable channel for improving on our societies. So that was question number one. Question number two, I think in some way is related. It was the corruption and development that for many countries, corruption is maybe the biggest, the most obvious problem hampering development. And I think you were even suggesting some of the answer to this yourself when you said that, well, there is corruption among the leaders, but also there is some corruption among the general population. Now, what would David Hume say? He would say, well, leaders, you always need to impose worst-case institutions. You want to have institutions that are robust to leaders being crooks. There shouldn't be enough space for them, for leaders, to actually be corrupt. You have to curtail their corruption. If you can curtail the corruption of the rulers, then hopefully we can also get rid of much of the corruption further down in the society. Because here I completely agree with Roland Benabou, who in this room yesterday said that, well, there is this trickle down. That if other people have certain beliefs, in particular if leaders have certain beliefs, then these beliefs are inherited. I think that's true also for behavior and social norms. The norms that the leaders will follow are also the norms that the followers will follow. So if you start by curtailing the behavior of leaders, and in this case by strong institutional checks and balances on their behavior, I think that's the necessary first step. The third question, I think, poses a slightly artificial dichotomy, but a dichotomy that is very pronounced in the scientific debate, namely that between biology and culture. So I think on the one hand, we know very well, and you did not deny, that humans aren't blank slates. So I think so those people who have tried to renounce Darwin and said that, well, there is no such thing as evolutionary psychology, I think that's very dangerous. A very unscientific position to take, because there is just so much evidence of evolution in human psychology. So you can't dismiss all that evidence. At the same time, to believe that that all human and social behavior is determined by this biology, that's equally false. Okay, just as our body imposes certain constraints, so does our psychology impose certain constraints. But within those constraints, there are just massive change. Massive change is possible, and we've seen that change. We know that cultures are very different, that countries are very differently organized, and that it's not really geographically bound, because we see these changes over time. Sweden can grow from being one of the world's poorest countries 130, 40 years ago to being one of the richest countries in the world, largely because of improved institutions. So this is what I meant when I say I think this dichotomy is false. We should not entertain it.
Altre domande, questioni?
More questions? There's somebody asking for the floor here in the front.
Yes, I just wanted to know, in your experiment on the dictatorship experiment, is it possible to contextualize it in the context where there are donors who give out money in developing countries? If so, how would you explain how corrupt governments still continue to receive donations from other countries? So what could be the other factors that contributed to this, considering that there's a corruption element and these governments continue to receive donations from the donors, from what we'd call dictators? Thank you.
Are you familiar with that part of Adam Smith where he speculated that he felt the future of mankind was very poor, since, precisely as you say, wanting esteem, he would just end up buying baubles and slaves rather than producing anything of value, that there would be a competition for esteem based on asocial or even antisocial activities. I wonder what your reaction to that is. I assert it does exist. I don't know if you know it. And how that points to how difficult it is to initiate change when, yes, culture is malleable, but the norms reflect the structure and the structure reflects the norms.
Faccio io una domanda. I will be the third, in order to allow the people to lasciare il tempo agli altri di pensare alle loro domande. Come la faccio? La faccio in italiano o in inglese?
Myself. Should I speak Italian or English? What would you prefer? So two questions there, actually. Two intertwined questions. One, Eriksen made the distinction between shame and guilt. And my question is as follows. The falsification of guilt may not depend on the fact that their way of understanding guilt was only based on the idea that my sin is or my guilt is the result of the others' expectations on my action, in that I only develop guilt because I don't meet other people's requirements, other people's expectations. But that expectation in itself has no normative content to it. Why should I feel any guilt for not complying with what other people expect from me? So if I basically go only against a belief or an expectation, there should be a social norm connected to it to make me feel truly guilty. And this seems to be the reason why shame seems to be more forceful, in that shame is a judgment passed by others on my action, as I did not comply with a rule that obviously I acknowledge. So apparently what is important is the normative value of norms, as it were. So my question is as follows. So shame perhaps is just the explanation of not respecting norms, of not complying with norms. But it could also be that we accept norms and we wish to comply with those norms, provided that the others do likewise. And this would be the explanation of the sense of justice that is drawn from Kant or John Rawls. So I would like to ask Professor Ellingsen, what is the potential explanation? Then second question on your experiments on esteem or praised, or the desire to be praised by people who we hold in high esteem or whom we praise. In a number of your works, you establish a connection between the esteem and the talent that these people may have, the skills that these people may have. So, for example, I could be happy to have other people considering me a talented man, or I tell the truth or lie with respect to my talents, to my skills. Well, don't you think that this could be a source of problems in that, as a matter of fact, it is not so straightforward that there is a moral norm stating that talent or skills should be appreciated as separate from efforts? Or what is our merit if we're skilled or talented? Why should we feel praised by the fact of having a talent if there's no effort to it? So, does talent deserve praise? In one of your experiments, if the employer doesn't know what the skills imply and he believes his employees are making an effort, not knowing whether these people are talented or make an effort, they work more, they work harder. Perhaps because they believe that their efforts can be appreciated rather than the skill or talent, which is totally coincidental and fortuitous. So my question is, don't you think there's a problem in bringing this or building this bridge between estimate or esteem and talent? Talent being fortuitous again. You may be born in Italy or in Stockholm or in Africa, and you may be born with talent or without talent. Whereas effort or endeavors is something that should be praised. So, so I think that, again, my question is on talent being chosen as one of the distinctive traits.
That we're doing can help explain or shed light over why it is that, for example, people in the developed world, governments in the developed world, continue to give help to developing country governments that are very corrupt. And I think, so there are two obvious explanations, obvious theoretical answers to this. And the one is that, well, in these countries with corrupt governments, you also find some of the world's very poorest people. And you feel so strongly that you need to help these poorest people. So even if only a moderate fraction of what you're giving will reach the recipient, you feel an obligation to help them. So that's the altruism motive. But then, of course, you have this other motive that part of the reason why, in general, we give, certainly in these dictator experiments, is we give in order to look good. And somehow, having this concern, displaying this concern for the worst of people is socially prestigious. So it's done for that reason. Now, which of these are the most likely, or whether any of these are really a good explanation, I truly don't know. Maybe there are other mechanisms at work that better explain why this happens, and maybe we can talk about that after. Okay, so Carla Hoff asked a question about Adam Smith being pessimistic about using social esteem or people's concern for social esteem for the good. And I think, so that is a skepticism that has been shared by many people down the road. But I should say, so Smith himself was absolutely concerned that people's desire for honor and in particular for justice, that these emotions were very good. But then it comes this, but then there are types of prestige that he thinks is bad. And Thorsten Veblen, of course, his concept of conspicuous consumption is a, what should we say, it's a later manifestation of the same worry. In fact, when you look at management thinkers such as Chester Barnard, when he says, when he discusses why a high wage or large bonuses would provide good incentives, Barnard says, well, it's not the money as such, it's the esteem that goes with the money. That's the real motivator. Now, and I should also say that nobility, so remember nobility's desire for titles, medals, and so on and so forth, has been criticized by the left as, creating a segregated society. And I think, so we could continue to produce examples, I think, where desire for prestige is a bad thing. But likewise, we can come up with examples where desire for social esteem is a good thing. So yesterday, Rachel Cranton spoke on the organization of the US military, where actually soldiers are not being paid very well at all, but instead they are led to internalize social norms and to be proud to do the right thing in complicated circumstances, and to display a certain set of values. So for me, that's the challenge. It seems that people have kind of almost a universal need for social esteem, and the challenge for us is to somehow channel what I see as a fundamental need, to challenge that in good directions. So as a society, how can we harness these desires, not for promoting competition and status races, but instead for good pro-social actions. I think it's very nice when Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, instead of building monuments, physical monuments over themselves and spending lavishly, they give money for eradicating malaria. I think the more prestige we can give people for that sort of action, the better it is. So the third questions were actually two questions on shame versus guilt. And you say that, well, maybe there are circumstances in which people actually do care or do take action in order to avoid guilt, and that is when somehow So I said in general you don't care about disappointing others, and you say, well, maybe you care about disappointing others if their expectations are morally justified. I think that's a wonderful point, and I think that you or someone else should run an experiment to try to find out just how good that point is. Okay, that's, we shouldn't be just philosophizing about these things, so let's find out. And I should say, Carla told me the other day that she always gets surprised by experimental findings. So do I. Okay, I have strong priors, what I will find. I don't often find what I think I will find. So there are strong reasons for actually trying this out experimentally. Your second question had to do with esteem for talent, and your argument that there isn't very much of a normative foundation for why we should esteem talent. And I agree with that. I nonetheless think it's inevitable that talent will be esteemed. And here we come back to Darwin again and sexual reproduction. As I said, when you prime men romantically, they just want to display how resourceful they are. And I think no amount of social engineering is going to get rid of this. Right? So whether that's morally good or bad, we can discuss, but I think this is something that we can't easily construct our way out of. There are some types of behaviors, and this goes for females too. I mean, we see modern females also wanting attention for physical attributes and so on and so forth. That is very hard to see any moral justification for this, but it's terribly hard to eradicate.
C'è tempo per una domanda e una risposta, perché dobbiamo finire entro le
Because we have to close by 4:30.
Il tempo di preparare la sala anche.
Because as you know, there will be another meeting after that, and we need to prepare the room, even though our speaker has already come here, the one for the next session, so do not leave, because the speaker of the next session is already here with us. Anyway, we can allow one more question and answer. Well, first of all, thank you very much, and congratulations. Thank you for enriching me with your presentation, and congratulations, because it was a very good presentation. I have a question on a very relevant topic in Italy at the moment. One of our ministers waged a war to the so-called lazy public officers, claiming that it is possible to increase the profitability and productivity of public administration by rigid behavioral norms regarding working time and absenteeism. This has certainly led to a significant reduction in the number of missed working hours by Italian public workers who more strictly follow their working timetable now. Conversely, in the past, there was a high degree of flexibility. And in the past, people came and went as they liked, but now they go at 8 o'clock precisely and leave their office at 2 p.m. on the spot. So, in your opinion, this rigidity applied to public administration in a non-differentiated way, because everybody would be blamed of being a lazy person, even if he or she provided an enormous contribution in terms of productivity, even at different working hours. Well, in your opinion, can this improve productivity, or do you believe that these measures can have a negative consequence in terms of the motivation and productivity of state employees? Right, that was a very precise question, but I would like to add the following.
Pubblici dipendenti è stata fatta così. Allora, 100
workers. Let's suppose that 100 euros are available as an incentive. So the office leaders will have to divide their staff in 3 categories. The topmost 25% in terms of productivity will receive 50% of the bonus. 50% will receive the other 50%, and the remaining 25%, independent of the effort they made, but since they rank 3rd in this classification, will get 0. So, of course, this is a sign of lack of appreciation towards them. What do you think about this incentive mechanism? How does it sound to you?
Okay, I'm actually glad that you said I only had to answer one more question. Because I think that the first question was easier to answer than the second one. Right, so I think it's important to make myself clear. When I say that there are certain downsides to using controls, supervision, strong monetary incentives, and so on. I do not want to say that using such instruments are never justified. So when I say that worst case thinking could have some downsides, I'm also not saying that you could never be right to do worst case thinking. Actually, I think that many of the examples where worst case thinking leads in the wrong direction is when you cannot really control very well anyway. And then you control all you can, but there are still so many degrees of freedom that you can't control very well, and so you only have the downside, almost only the downside. That's the real danger. When you can control quite well, there are often reasons to do so. And also, I think, when you have established very poor norms, you suggested that maybe work morale was at a very low level, and then even the people who intrinsically would like to behave well, they don't get any social esteem from it, because the environment, it's not expected of them, and anyone, and their neighbor will not believe that they're doing good work anyway. So for them, it's very helpful if you can, you can increase the image of everyone. So it sounds to me, I don't know much about this reform, but it sounds to me that pursuing such reforms can be perfectly consistent with the line of thinking that I'm advocating.
Bene, abbiamo finito il nostro tempo. Grazie.